The soldier came home to an empty street. Then the neighbors stepped out. He stepped out of the cab with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, and the first thing he noticed was how quiet the street was. Too quiet for the homecoming he had pictured in his mind. Months of sand, dust, and endless noise overseas had made him crave this moment. His return to a place that was supposed to feel safe, familiar, and alive. But as he looked down the block, every window was closed, every driveway empty, and not a single curtain stirred. It was as though the neighborhood had been abandoned. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. The soldier shifted his weight, the duffel sliding slightly against his back. He scanned the street again, searching for something ordinary, maybe a car door shutting, a neighbor mowing the lawn, the sound of a basketball bouncing on the cracked pavement. Nothing. Just stillness and the faint rustle of leaves moving across the asphalt. He adjusted the brim of his cap and drew in a long breath, reminding himself that this was home. But then why did it feel like a stranger's place? His boots felt heavier than they should have as he started walking slowly down the block. He glanced at the familiar houses he had memorized from childhood, the one with the red shutters where Mr. Reynolds used to sit on the porch, the blue bungalow where Mrs. Johnson had always kept a flower garden in full bloom, and the duplex where kids once shouted and laughed while riding bikes until the streetlights came on. Yet now, each home looked locked up, almost guarded. Curtains drawn, doors shut, not a sign of life. The soldier's brow furrowed. He had left chaos behind, expecting to find warmth. Instead, he was met with silence. His thoughts drifted back to the day he enlisted, how the neighbors had thrown a small send-off for him. They grilled burgers in the Reynolds' backyard, everyone sharing stories, clapping him on the back, promising they would look out for his family while he was gone. There had been laughter, cheers, and even tears as he boarded the bus. He remembered the way Mrs. Johnson had pressed a small Bible into his hand, telling him she would be praying every day. Back then, this street had felt alive, like a community that stood together. But today, it felt like no one had waited, like maybe life had moved on without him. The soldier's chest tightened. He tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe people were at work. Maybe the kids were at school. Maybe the timing was off. Still, the silence gnawed at him. He slowed his pace and listened carefully, hoping for any sign of normalcy. The faint hum of traffic from a distant highway reached his ears, but not here. Not on his block. His eyes traced over the houses once more. He noticed how the lawns seemed freshly mowed, how the driveways were swept clean, how the porches were free of clutter. Almost too perfect, as if someone had made sure everything looked just right. The soldier shook his head, forcing a half smile. Maybe he was just imagining things. After all, he had been gone for a long time. Things change. He tugged his duffel higher and kept walking, his boots echoing softly against the pavement. The rhythm of his steps filled the void of sound, the only reminder that he was still here, still moving forward. He passed the corner where he and his friends used to gather after school. They'd toss a football around or plan their next adventure. He could almost hear their voices again, could almost see their teenage selves, carefree and unbothered by the weight of the world. The memory felt sharp against the dull silence of the present. As he walked, a flicker of doubt entered his mind. Maybe he had built this moment up too much. Maybe homecomings weren't meant to be grand. Maybe it was selfish to expect a street lined with smiling faces. He clenched his jaw, forcing the thought away. All he wanted was a sign. One sign that someone had remembered him. One sign that his sacrifices meant something. The soldier reached the middle of the block and stopped. His eyes lingered on his own house at the far end, but he didn't move toward it yet. He needed time to gather himself, to brace for what awaited behind that door. Would it be warm and welcoming, or just another kind of silence? For the first time since he had returned, he felt the ache of loneliness settling in his bones, the kind that came not from being far away, but from being surrounded by everything familiar and finding it changed. He gripped the strap of his duffel tighter and stood still, waiting, listening, hoping that at any moment the silence would break. The street stayed empty. The soldier swallowed hard. This wasn't the homecoming he had imagined. Not even close. And yet, deep down, something told him the story wasn't over. Not yet. The soldier adjusted his grip on the duffel bag and started moving again, his boots dragging a little more than before. Every step echoed in the still air, bouncing off the shuttered homes around him. The longer he walked, the more unsettling the silence became. He had spent months overseas dreaming of this very street, the sound of kids shouting as they rode bikes down the sidewalk, the familiar smell of someone grilling burgers in a backyard. Now, he found none of that. Just rows of houses staring back at him with blank faces, windows closed tight like eyes that refused to meet his. He slowed his pace, glancing side to side. The Johnsons' house came into view, and for a moment, he almost expected to see Mrs. Johnson crouched in her garden, pulling weeds or tending her roses. She always had her straw hat on, her hands covered in dirt, but her smile bright whenever she looked up. Instead, the flower beds were empty. Not even a potted plant on the porch. It made the house feel less like a home and more like an empty shell. Next door, the Reynolds place looked the same as it had when he left. The shutters were painted the same shade of red. The porch swing still hung from its rusted chain, but the swing was motionless, no one sitting out front like before. Mr. Reynolds used to be there every afternoon with a newspaper and a glass of iced tea, ready to wave at anyone who passed by. The soldier's eyes lingered on the swing, almost willing it to move, almost waiting for the old man to step out. But nothing happened. The silence held. He shifted the strap of his bag again, the weight digging into his shoulder. He had carried far heavier loads in harsher places, but this one seemed harder somehow. It wasn't just the gear. It was the feeling pressing down on him, the sense that something wasn't right here. His chest grew tight with the thought. He passed the duplex where the kids always played. The soldier remembered coming home from school to find chalk drawings scattered across the sidewalk, stick figures and hopscotch squares marking the concrete. Now the pavement was scrubbed clean. No chalk, no bikes left out, no soccer balls lying in the grass, just an empty patch of sidewalk where laughter used to live. He let out a slow breath. Had everyone really moved on so quickly? The thought made him uncomfortable. People had promised to keep things the same, to hold the street together until he came back. But nothing looked the same. The yards were kept up, the houses cared for, but there was no life behind the windows. It was as if the neighborhood had pressed pause on everything, waiting for some unseen moment. He stopped near the middle of the block and set his bag down for a second, running a hand over his face. His mind replayed the nights overseas when he'd close his eyes and imagine this street. He used to picture it noisy and alive, every detail perfect. It had been his anchor, the place he told himself he would return to when the worst nights felt unbearable. And now, here he was, standing in the middle of that same street, and it felt foreign. His eyes narrowed as he studied the houses more closely. He noticed little things he had missed at first. A curtain shifting ever so slightly in an upstairs window, the faintest glimmer of movement behind a screen door. Someone was there. He was sure of it. They were watching him, but no one came out. The soldier felt his pulse quicken. Why would they hide? Was it him, Did people not know how to face him after so long away? Or had something happened that no one wanted to speak about? He tightened his fists, the questions rattling in his mind. Picking up his bag again, he started walking toward his house at the end of the block. The silence was heavier here, pressing into his ears. Each step felt slower, each glance sharper. He wanted to hear something, anything. A door creak, a voice calling his name, even a dog barking from behind a fence, but none of it came. The soldier swallowed hard and tried to steady himself. He wasn't afraid of silence, not after where he had been. But this silence was different. It wasn't natural. It wasn't the kind that came from peace. It was the kind that came from waiting. And as much as it unsettled him, he couldn't shake the feeling that the street wasn't empty at all. It was holding something back, something meant for him. He squared his shoulders and kept walking, the quiet block stretching out in front of him like a secret he hadn't yet uncovered. The soldier slowed his steps as he passed the row of houses that once defined his childhood. Each one carried memories that felt louder than the silence around him. He didn't need to knock on doors or peer inside. He already knew who lived where, who had laughed on which porch, and who had always been there to wave goodnight before the streetlights buzzed to life. But now, all of it felt like a memory someone had packed away in a box and left to gather dust. His eyes settled on the corner house with the wide porch and peeling paint. That had been the hangout spot during summer evenings. Neighbors would gather there with folding chairs, trading stories while kids ran barefoot in the grass. He could almost smell the grilled hot dogs and hear the chorus of voices overlapping each other in easy conversation. He blinked, and the porch was empty again, the silence snapping him back to reality. The old wood looked gray and weathered, the chairs gone. He adjusted his duffel and continued down the sidewalk, his eyes landing on another familiar sight, the little yellow house with the sagging basketball hoop attached to the garage. He and his friends had spent hours there, the thud of the ball echoing down the block, neighbors shouting at them to quiet down after dark. He smiled faintly at the thought. Those nights felt so close, yet the driveway now looked too clean, too neat. No ball rolled across the cracked pavement. No laughter spilled out into the evening air. The soldier's boots scuffed against the concrete as he walked on, and he caught sight of the white picket fence a few houses down. That fence had always been chipped and crooked, but it had belonged to a family that never missed a chance to decorate. Holidays meant string lights wrapped around every post, pumpkins lined up at Halloween, flags waving on the 4th of July. He paused at the gate, remembering how it had looked the day he left, covered in red, white, and blue bunting, neighbors waving little flags as they sent him off. Now the fence was freshly painted, bright and straight, but bare. No lights, no bunting, no sign of the joy it once carried. The soldier gripped the strap of his bag tighter. He thought about the way his neighbors had stood together that day, promising to take care of one another, promising to take care of his family while he served. Their voices had been strong, their support unshakable. And yet, walking this street now, he felt as if those promises had faded. The memories rang louder in his head than the silence in front of him, and it unsettled him in ways he hadn't expected. His gaze shifted to the small park at the end of the street. He could see the swing set through the trees. It was where the kids used to gather until their parents called them in for dinner. He remembered walking past it before his deployment, hearing the creak of swings and the sharp laughter of children chasing each other in the grass. But now the swings hung still, the seats twisting slightly in the breeze. The emptiness of the park mirrored the emptiness of the block. The soldier drew in a slow breath. These weren't just houses. They were pieces of a life he had carried with him overseas. They were what had kept him steady during the hardest days. Every time he closed his eyes in the barracks, he pictured these porches, these driveways, these sidewalks alive with people who mattered to him. Now, standing here again, it felt like he had come home to a place that had forgotten how to breathe. His chest tightened as he walked farther. The memories pressed in on him harder with every step. He remembered the summer cookouts when the whole block came together, the smell of barbecue drifting through the air, the sound of clinking glasses and music playing from someone's speaker. He remembered the nights when he'd sit on his porch and watch the world around him, comfortable in the knowledge that this street was more than just neighbors. It was family. But tonight, there was none of that. The silence drowned out those memories, leaving him with only echoes. He searched the windows again, hoping to catch a familiar face peeking out, someone brave enough to open the door and wave. Nothing. Just stillness. The soldier slowed to a stop in the middle of the block and looked around again. He let his eyes sweep over every detail, the porches, the lawns, the driveways. It all looked neat and cared for, but lifeless. Like someone had pressed pause on the neighborhood the day he left and never hit play again. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away, but it clung to him like the weight of his bag. This street had been his anchor when everything else felt uncertain. It was supposed to be the one place that never changed. And yet, as he stood there, surrounded by houses that should have been alive with laughter and conversation, he couldn't help but wonder if the place he had longed for had slipped away while he was gone. The memories were still there, but the life behind them seemed to have vanished. It wasn't just disappointing, it was crushing. He forced himself to take another step, the weight of his boots heavy against the concrete. His house was closer now, but he slowed, not ready to face what might be waiting inside. He remembered the promises his neighbors had made when he left. They said they would look out for his family. They said they would keep things the same so he'd have a place to return to. But from the way the street looked tonight, he wasn't sure anyone had kept their word. He thought about Mrs. Johnson, who had pressed that Bible into his hands the day he shipped out. She had said she would pray for him every night. Did she still think of him? Did she even live here anymore? He glanced at her house, its curtains drawn tight, the porch empty. No flowers in her garden, no sign of her presence. The doubt deepened in his chest. Maybe she had moved away. Maybe everyone had. He tried to shake off the thought, but his mind kept circling back to the same fear. He had been forgotten. He had given up so much to serve, to protect, to carry the weight of something bigger than himself. And now he wondered if that sacrifice had even mattered here, on the very street that had once felt like his foundation. The soldier slowed his pace again, his duffel dragging against his back. Maybe the people he loved had filled his absence with new routines, new traditions, ones that didn't include him anymore. The thought burned. He rubbed a hand over his face and exhaled slowly. He had trained himself to survive chaos, to handle uncertainty and danger without blinking. But this silence, this possibility of being erased from the life he had known, it rattled him in a way he wasn't prepared for. His heart felt heavy, and he couldn't tell if it was from exhaustion or disappointment. As he walked, the street stretched out in front of him like a question with no answer. He caught himself glancing at each door, half expecting someone to swing it open and shout his name. But no one did. The longer it stayed quiet, the stronger the doubt grew. Maybe he had built this moment up too much in his head. Maybe homecomings weren't like the stories. Maybe they were quiet, empty, and lonely. He drew in a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Doubt was dangerous. It clouded judgment, twisted thoughts. He knew that from experience. But tonight, walking down this silent street, doubt felt like the only thing he could hear. It whispered that he no longer belonged here, that the welcome he had dreamed of was nothing more than a fantasy. He stood there for a moment, listening. The neighborhood was still quiet, unnervingly so. No porch lights flicked on, no car doors slammed, not even the faint echo of voices from inside the houses. Just him, standing in the place that was supposed to welcome him back. His chest tightened as he imagined how different this moment could have been. A cheer, a wave, maybe a neighbor running over with open arms. But the longer he stood there, the clearer it became that none of that was happening. He let the duffel slide off his shoulder and drop to the ground with a dull thud. The weight leaving his back didn't ease the heaviness inside. He kept his eyes locked on the door, as though stepping inside would answer every question he carried. But part of him hesitated. What if the silence followed him in there? What if he wasn't just walking into an empty street, but an empty house? He dragged a hand across his face, feeling the grit of exhaustion in every line. Overseas, he had longed for this moment. Coming home was what pushed him through endless days. The idea that at the end of it all, he would walk this path, cross this yard, and finally feel like himself again. But standing here now, he didn't feel like the man he had been before. He felt like someone out of place, a visitor in his own story. He glanced back down the street, scanning the rows of houses again. Every window seemed to watch him, yet none opened. He could almost sense people behind them, aware of him but choosing to remain hidden. The thought unsettled him. It made the silence feel intentional, as if the street itself had decided to keep its distance. The soldier let out a slow breath. The loneliness he felt in that moment wasn't the same as the kind he had endured overseas. Out there, being alone was expected. Out there, silence could mean survival. But here, in the middle of the place he had spent his life calling home, the silence was unbearable. It pressed on him harder than the noise of war ever had. He bent down and touched the duffel bag, running his fingers over the worn fabric. He thought about everything that bag carried, not just clothes and gear, but months of struggle, nights of fear, and the hope that had gotten him through, hope that this homecoming would make it all worth it. But now, even that hope felt fragile. He straightened and took a step toward the door, then stopped again. He wasn't ready. Not yet. He needed to steady himself before he walked inside, before he faced what might be waiting on the other side. He turned his head and looked back at the street one more time. The emptiness stretched in both directions, houses lined up like silent witnesses to his return. His throat tightened as he thought about how it used to be. He remembered standing in this exact spot years ago, watching kids chase each other with sparklers on the 4th of July, hearing the crack of fireworks overhead, smelling hamburgers cooking on grills, the whole block alive, families out on porches, voices blending together. That memory cut deeper now. To think that he had traded months of his life, believing he was protecting this way of life, only to come home and find it gone, it was almost too much to bear. He rubbed his hands together, the cool evening air settling into his bones. The duffel still sat at his feet, waiting, but he felt frozen. The silence was winning, pulling him into doubt and loneliness. He clenched his jaw, fighting the weight pressing down on him. He wasn't afraid of what was behind that door. What unsettled him was the idea that maybe nothing had waited for him at all. The soldier looked at his home again, the porch light dark, the windows still. He drew in a deep breath, willing himself to move forward. But in that moment, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had never been so alone. Not in the desert, not in the barracks, not on the battlefield. Here, in the middle of his own street, he felt the full force of isolation. And yet, deep inside, something told him this silence wasn't just emptiness. It was waiting. The question was, waiting for what? The soldier gripped the strap of his duffel again, preparing himself to finally take the step onto the porch, when a sound cut through the silence. It was faint at first, almost so quiet he thought he had imagined it, the creak of a door opening. His head snapped toward the noise, his eyes scanning the houses along the street. One of the front doors, halfway down the block, had opened just enough to reveal a shadowed figure. The soldier froze. After all this silence, the smallest sound felt enormous. He squinted, trying to make out who it was, but before he could, the door opened wider. A neighbor stepped out, standing on their porch, with both hands gripping the railing. They didn't call out, not yet, but they were looking right at him. The soldier's pulse quickened. He stayed still, unsure of what to do. He hadn't expected anyone at this point. For a moment, it seemed like the two of them were caught in a silent standoff, one watching the other, neither speaking. Then, just as he opened his mouth to say something, another sound broke the stillness. Another door. A screen door on the opposite side of the street creaked open, followed by the sharp squeal of its spring snapping back. The soldier's eyes darted over, and he saw another neighbor stepping out, this one holding the hand of a small child who peeked curiously from behind their leg. The soldier blinked, his mind struggling to keep up. Within moments, more doors began to stir. He heard hinges creak and locks click open. The silence that had weighed down the block was unraveling, replaced with the subtle, steady sounds of life. A door slammed softly shut. Footsteps echoed against porches. Curtains were pulled back to reveal faces. Everywhere he looked, people were beginning to appear. The soldier's chest tightened as he tried to take it in. The same houses that had looked empty minutes ago were now spilling out their occupants. Neighbors he hadn't seen in years were stepping onto their porches, their eyes fixed on him. Some held back as if unsure of what to say. Others simply stood tall, their faces soft but unmistakably focused on him. He glanced back at the first neighbor, the one who had stepped out first. They gave him a small nod, not breaking eye contact. It wasn't a wave. It wasn't a cheer. It was something steadier, something that carried weight. The soldier swallowed hard, his throat tight. More doors opened. More neighbors stepped out. Some had folded arms. Others let their hands rest on the railings of their porches. But all of them were looking in the same direction. At him. The soldier's thoughts swirled. Why now? Why had they stayed hidden until this very moment? He had walked the whole block, certain he was alone. Yet here they were, one after another, revealing themselves, as if they had all been waiting for a signal. The breeze shifted, carrying the sound of voices murmuring softly to one another. He caught snippets. He's here, and that's him. His heart thudded harder in his chest. He gripped the strap of his duffel so tightly his knuckles whitened. Not because of the weight, but because of the sudden rush of emotions rising inside him. For the first time since stepping onto this street, he didn't feel completely alone. The silence that had haunted him was gone, broken by the creak of doors and the presence of people who hadn't forgotten him after all. The soldier let out a shaky breath, his eyes darting from porch to porch. The neighbors weren't moving closer yet, but he could feel it. Something was about to happen. The stillness that had lingered so heavily was gone, replaced by a waiting energy, like the whole block was holding its breath. He straightened his shoulders and looked down the street again. It was no longer empty. One neighbor had stepped out, then another, and then another. The street was waking up, piece by piece, and every pair of eyes was fixed on him. Something inside him stirred that he hadn't felt since he left. A flicker of belonging. But as the soldier stood frozen in place, one question filled his mind. What were they all waiting for? The soldier's eyes moved from one porch to another, his heart pounding harder with every sound of a door opening. What had moments ago been an empty, lifeless block was suddenly alive with movement. Neighbors were stepping out of their homes one by one, and the quiet street he had walked alone was filling with voices, footsteps, and the unmistakable hum of people gathering. He blinked, trying to take it all in. To his left, Mr. Reynolds shuffled down the steps of his porch, holding onto the railing as he made his way toward the sidewalk. The man looked older, slower, but his face carried the same steady warmth it always had. Across the street, Mrs. Johnson appeared, her familiar straw hat perched on her head. This time, she wasn't kneeling in her garden. She was standing tall, clutching something against her chest as she watched him with eyes that glistened in the fading light. The soldier's throat tightened as he realized what was happening. This wasn't random. This wasn't neighbors simply stepping out at the same time. They had been waiting for him. All this time, hiding behind curtains and closed doors, they had been watching and waiting for the moment he reached his own yard. Then it happened. A voice rang out from the crowd, clear and strong. "Welcome home!" The words cut through the air, sharp against the silence that had lingered for too long. The soldier froze. His chest tightened, his breath caught, and before he could respond, another voice joined in. "We're so glad you're back." One by one, the neighbors began to clap. Slowly at first, the sound scattering across the block like raindrops. But within seconds, the clapping grew louder, steadier, until the entire street was echoing with it. The soldier turned in a slow circle, his eyes wide, watching as people filled the sidewalks, cheering, smiling, and calling his name. Children ran ahead of their parents, waving small handmade signs that read, "Welcome back," and "We missed you." Someone shook a set of bells, the sound bright and joyful in the evening air. The soldier's chest ached with emotion, the weight of loneliness lifting all at once as the noise washed over him. He dropped his duffel to the ground again, his hands trembling as he looked around. Everywhere he turned, there were faces he knew. Neighbors who had raised families alongside his, people who had seen him grow up, friends who had promised to be here when he left. And here they were. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward from her porch, her hands still clutching the Bible she had once given him. She lifted it slightly, almost as if to remind him that she had kept her word, that she had prayed every day. He swallowed hard, unable to speak. The clapping grew louder. Voices rose together, calling his name, cheering, crying, shouting words he couldn't fully hear over the sound of it all. The street wasn't empty anymore. It was alive. And it was alive for him. The soldier felt his knees weaken as the emotions hit him all at once. He had spent the entire walk down this block believing he had been forgotten, convinced that the silence meant he no longer had a place here. But as the neighbors surrounded him with their voices, their signs, their smiles, he realized he hadn't been forgotten at all. They had been waiting for the right moment to show him just how much he mattered. He looked down at the duffel by his feet, the bag that carried the weight of his months overseas. For the first time, it didn't feel heavy anymore. The burden he had been carrying inside him was being lifted by every clap, every cheer, every sign. He straightened his shoulders, his eyes wet, and let himself finally breathe. This was home, and it was alive again. All because his neighbors had chosen to step out, together, to remind him that he had never been alone. The soldier stood frozen as the cheers rolled down the block, echoing off the houses that only minutes ago had been silent. He turned slowly, his eyes sweeping over the crowd that had gathered in front of him. The neighbors weren't just stepping out casually, they had been planning this. The signs, the timing, the way every single door seemed to open within seconds of one another. It all fit together like a puzzle he hadn't been able to see until now. A lump rose in his throat as he watched the Reynolds kids race toward him with bright poster boards in their hands. One read, "Our hero is home." The other said, "We missed you." The words were written in thick marker, the letters uneven but filled with love. Behind them, their parents clapped and smiled, their faces proud and warm. Across the street, a group of neighbors carried a banner stretched between them. It had his name painted in bold letters, the words, "Welcome Back," outlined with stars and stripes. The fabric rippled in the breeze as they lifted it high for him to see. The soldier's vision blurred as his eyes filled with tears. He tried to blink them away, but the emotions came faster than he could control. People were moving closer now, spilling off their porches and onto the sidewalks. Some clapped, some cheered, some simply smiled as they reached out hands to him. Mrs. Johnson made her way forward, the Bible still in her grasp. When she reached him, she pressed it gently into his hands once more. "Told you I'd be praying," she said softly. The soldier swallowed hard, nodding, unable to find words. One by one, neighbors stepped up to greet him. Some hugged him tightly, others shook his hand with firm grips that lingered. Children peeked out from behind their parents' legs, their eyes wide with admiration, as if they were looking at more than just a man. They were looking at a hero. The soldier felt his chest ache, but this time it wasn't from loneliness. It was from the overwhelming wave of love and belonging that surrounded him. He had imagined so many different versions of this homecoming, but nothing like this. He had walked down an empty street convinced that he had been forgotten. Yet here was proof that he hadn't been. Not for a second. The silence had been part of the plan. They had wanted to give him this moment, a moment where every voice, every cheer, every clap was for him. The sound of the crowd swelled again, the cheers overlapping into a roar that seemed to vibrate through the ground. People raised their signs higher, their voices stronger. Someone began to chant his name, and soon the entire block had joined in. The soldier pressed his hand to his chest, the tears finally spilling down his face. He wasn't embarrassed. Not here. Not surrounded by the very people who had made this street feel alive again. He caught sight of a few neighbors holding phones, recording the moment. But it didn't feel staged. It didn't feel like a performance. It felt real. Genuine. Every clap, every word, every tear in their eyes told him this wasn't just about honoring him. It was about showing him he was still part of this family. Still part of this community. He took a step forward, reaching down to lift the Reynolds boy onto his shoulders. The child giggled, holding up the sign high in the air as the neighbors cheered louder. The soldier laughed through his tears, his voice finally breaking free. "I missed you all," he said, his words swallowed by the sound of applause. The empty street was gone. In its place was something better. His neighbors, his friends, his family, standing together to show him he had never been alone. He bent to grab his duffel, but before he could lift it, two neighbors rushed forward and picked it up for him. "You've carried enough," one of them said firmly. The soldier's throat tightened at the simple gesture. He nodded his thanks, unable to speak as emotion crowded his chest. Mrs. Johnson stepped closer again, resting her hand on his arm. Her eyes were wet, but steady. "We kept our promise," she said softly. "We never forgot you." The soldier looked at her and saw the truth in her words. He had doubted. He had let the silence convince him he had been erased. But here was proof that he had been held in their hearts all along. He looked down the street, at the houses that had seemed cold and empty only an hour ago. Now their porches glowed with light, their yards filled with laughter and voices. The neighborhood he thought had gone quiet forever had come alive again, all for him. Someone brought out a tray of food, sandwiches, chips, and bottled water, and set it on a folding table near the curb. Another neighbor rolled out a speaker, music beginning to float through the air. The block was transforming in front of him, shifting from silence to celebration. Children darted between adults, holding sparklers that glowed faintly against the dusk. The smell of grilled burgers drifted through the air, the same smell he had dreamed about during endless nights overseas. The soldier laughed through his tears, shaking hands, hugging old friends, and listening as voices overlapped with stories, questions, and words of gratitude. "We're proud of you. We prayed every day. We missed you." Each sentence landed like a weight lifting off his chest. He looked up at the sky for a moment, taking it all in. The weight he had carried for so long, the fear of being forgotten, the loneliness that had pressed on him with every silent step, was gone. In its place was a warmth that settled deep into his bones. For the first time since leaving, he didn't feel like a visitor in his own life. He felt like he belonged again. As the night grew darker, the crowd lingered, refusing to let the moment end too quickly. The soldier sat on the front steps of his house. Neighbors gathered around him. His duffel sat nearby, no longer heavy, just a reminder of where he had been. He rested his elbows on his knees and smiled as children laughed and neighbors chatted, the hum of community stronger than it had ever been. He realized then that home wasn't just the walls of his house. Home was this street, these people, this love that had waited patiently for him to return. It wasn't empty. It had never been empty. It had been waiting, holding its breath, saving this moment to remind him exactly where he belonged. The soldier took a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs. For months he had wondered what it would feel like to be back, and now he knew. It felt like healing. It felt like peace. It felt like home. And as the neighbors gathered closer, clapping and smiling, the soldier finally let himself believe it. He wasn't alone. He was surrounded, remembered, and welcomed, not just as a man who had left, but as one who had truly come home. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.